The title In Memoriam A.H.H is a favorite topic of question paper setters. It's a very interesting topic. Not every work has a title with such an interesting history behind it. It was after much deliberation that Tennyson decided to title the work under discussion In Memoriam A.H.H. In fact, he had toyed with other options, and it is said that the original title of the work was The Way of the Soul. The Way of the Soul. Perhaps The Way of the Soul would have been a more representative title of the work, because the work is not merely about the death of Arthur Henry Hallam at the age of 22 in Vienna, but also about innumerable other things. Innumerable other things. In fact, the poet uses the demise, the untimely demise of Hallam, as an opportunity to grapple with larger issues in society, religion, science, politics, and the work also traces the evolution of the poet, the development of the poet on psychological, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual planes. Be that as it may, Tennyson finally decided to call his work In Memoriam A.H.H. Students and teachers almost always refer to the work as In Memoriam. In fact, hardly anyone calls it In Memoriam A.H.H, especially in speech. Maybe in writing they do so. But I would like to observe that the title In Memoriam, if that is what we decide to call the work, is an incomplete title. Because in memoriam means in memory of. What does it mean? In memory of. In memory of what? In memory of whom? It does not make much sense. Strictly speaking, the work has to be referred to as In Memoriam A.H.H, which means in memory of Arthur Henry Hallam, which is precisely what the work is. It is interesting to note that some of the early editions of the work had cover pages in which the title was given simply as In Memoriam, not In Memoriam A.H.H. This may seem to strengthen the case of our students and our teachers who refuse to refer to the work using its full name, using its full title. For example, in the 1850 edition of the work, brought out by Edward Moxon of Dover Street, the title of the work as printed on the cover page is just In Memoriam. The book is 90 pages long. I would say that even this does not justify the use of a title which is incomplete, which does not make sense or does not make full sense. Besides, One of the cardinal principles of the MLA handbook, the Modern Language Association handbook, whatever be the edition, is that you must decide the title of a work. You must decide the title of a work not on the basis of what is printed on the cover page, but on the basis of what is printed on the title page. All said and done, I would say that it is best to refer to the work as In Memoriam A.H.H. There is no doubt that the work has a very appropriate title. The very trigger of inspiration for the work was the death of Hallam. If Hallam had not died, there would not have been In Memoriam A.H.H. And Hallam is certainly the most important figure in the work. Though the poet uses the untimely demise of Hallam as an opportunity to discuss numerous issues, it is undeniable that Hallam and his death dominate the work. So it cannot be said that the title of the work is inappropriate. It's highly appropriate. I would like to observe that Lord Tennyson had a weakness for fancy titles, especially titles borrowed from other languages. Take the present work, take the work under consideration, for example. In Memoriam A.H.H. It has a Latin title. The poet could very well have written in memory of Arthur Henry Hallam, in memory of A.H.H. But the poet chose to write in memoriam A.H.H. Similarly, we have the example of Tennyson's work, Mort the Arthur. Mort the Arthur means the passing of Arthur, the death of Arthur, the demise of Arthur. There, the poet uses a French title, just as here he uses a Latin title. Maybe I should say, here he uses a Latinate title, and there he uses a Frenchified title. Whatever be the case, Tennyson had a weakness for fancy titles, and this weakness is very much reflected in the choice of the title of the work under discussion. In Memoriam A.H.H. deals with numerous themes, but without doubt, the single most important theme of the work is the death of Arthur Henry Hallam, as is clearly indicated by the title of the work, In Memory of Arthur Henry Hallam. Hallam was a very dear friend of Tennyson, probably the dearest friend that Tennyson had at Cambridge. The critic Christopher Ricks says that the friendship between Tennyson and Hallam, who saw each other for the first time at Cambridge, was swift and deep. Hallam was something of a Renaissance man, the son of a noted historian. Hallam came from a well-off family, had studied at Eton along with the future Prime Minister Gladstone, was gifted, charming, and possessed a magnetic personality. Hallam fell in love with Tennyson's sister Emilia, better known as Emily, and was engaged to her when he suddenly breathes his last in the middle of his continental tour at the tender age of 22. The death of Hallam is certainly the single most important theme dealt with by the work. But the thematic focus of the work is never ever exclusively on the demise of Hallam. The untimely demise of Hallam, the unfortunate demise of Hallam, offers the poet the opportunity to grapple with a number of themes. The first of these is the theme of death. What is death? What happens after death? Why does death take place in such an unreasonable, such an arbitrary manner? In some of the cantos of the work, Tennyson ponders over these questions. Another theme of the work is the spiritual identity of man, the soul of man. What is the spiritual self of man? What happens to the soul when death occurs? How do we explain the spiritual character of a human being? It is understandable that under these circumstances, the poet is compelled to discuss religion, especially Christianity. Though the poet appears to be open to other religious points of view, he generally attempts to reinforce the Christian worldview, the Christian perspective. There are numerous attempts in the text of In Memoriam A.H.H. to justify the Christian explanatory system, to justify Christian theology, to valorize the Christian way of thought, to demonstrate the superiority of the Christian explanatory system over other systems. The Victorian period was a period of remarkable scientific expansion. The poet, as a well-informed, well-read young man, was acutely aware of these scientific advances. And this awareness is repeatedly reflected in the text of the work. It can be said that there was a sort of conflict between science, its discoveries, its inventions, its explanations on the one hand, and Christianity and religion, Christianity, its theology, its traditions, its beliefs on the other. This conflict is effectively captured in Memoriam A.H.H. It can be said that In Memoriam A.H.H. is a site for This monumental conflict between science and religion that took place in the Victorian age. Nature is an important theme dealt with in In Memoriam A.H.H. As a schoolboy, Tennyson picked up the habit of going for long walks through the English countryside. He was a keen observer, a sensitive observer, and a passionate lover of nature. He writes about the glory of the English countryside, the beauty of the English countryside, with its hills and rivers, its flora and fauna, in the work under consideration. Without any exaggeration, it can be claimed that English nature comes alive in In Memoriam A.H.H. Tennyson was throughout his life a keen student of history and political science. He was acutely aware of the political problems faced by Victorian England and also of the important political events in European history. There are allusions in Memoriam A.H.H. to political events such as revolutions, including the French Revolution. There are also references to power, to the use of power, to the arbitrary use of power, to the limits that should be imposed on power, and to the responsibilities that go along with power. There is no doubt that In Memoriam A.H.H. is a work written by a very diligent student of history and political science. We have already said that the single most important theme of In Memoriam A.H.H. is death, the death of Hallam, and everything that flows out of the death of Hallam as a consequence. But an important theme of the work is also marriage. The marriage of Hallam that should have taken place, but which never took place. Hallam was engaged to be married to Tennyson's sister, Amelia. As I said, marriage is also a theme, an important theme of the work, because the poet sees birth and death as counterparts, joy and sorrow as counterparts, celebration and mourning as counterparts. And the poem concludes with an epilogue, which is celebratory of the marriage of the poet's sister, Cecilia, to Edmund Lushington, Edmund Law Lushington, who later became professor of Greek at Glasgow University. There is no doubt that there is a strong autobiographical element in In Memoriam A.H.H. In fact, no elegy can easily escape possessing an autobiographical element. I would go far as to suggest that an important thematic strand of the work is the poet himself. It may sound weird at first sight, but if you analyze the work carefully, you will find that the work is about the poet himself, at least to some extent. The poet, his experiences, his development over the years, his reactions to various events, his perspectives, the philosophies that he cherishes, the doubts that erupt in his heart, his moods, the changes that his moods undergo, his relationships. Or we can very safely say that an important theme of In Memoriam A.H.H. is the poet himself. In Memoriam A.H.H. is an elegy. In fact, one of the great elegies of the English language. It is part of the great tradition of elegies, which includes Lycidas of John Milton and Adonais of P.B. Shelley. However, many readers find Lord Tennyson's work to be more powerful than either Lycidas or Adonais, because In Memoriam A.H.H. is not hampered by pastoral traditions. In Memoriam A.H.H. is an elegy, but not a pastoral elegy. Hence, there is no necessity for the poet to make his characters wear pastoral masks. The outpouring of grief in Memoriam A.H.H., the expression of sorrow is direct, and hence the work appeals to the heart of the reader, touches the heart of the reader in a way in which a pastoral elegy is unable to. In Memoriam A.H.H. is divided into 131 cantos. The cantos are prefixed with a prologue, and after the 131 cantos, comes the epilogue. Every canto consists of stanzas, and every stanza is made up of 4 lines. The meter uses iambic tetrameter. This means that every line has 4 sets of iambs. Tetrameter, 4 feet. Every foot is an iamb. An iamb is a foot consisting of 2 syllables. The first syllable is an unstressed syllable, and the second syllable is a stressed syllable. The first syllable is a short syllable and the second syllable is a long syllable. It is to be commented that Lord Tennyson's command over meter is superb and that his use of iambic tetrameter in Memoriam A.H.H is as perfect as possible. In fact, it is relentlessly regular, and it is only very rarely that one can detect even a minor deviation from metrical regularity. The rhyme scheme used is A B B A. I repeat, A B B A. There are dramatic changes in theme and mood in the work under consideration. But the meter does not change. To express such differing themes, such differing moods, using the same meter is a monumental achievement which perhaps only Tennyson is capable of. There is a strong element of lyricism in the work. The lyrical element dominates the entire work from the prologue, from the first canto to the last canto to the epilogue. In fact, the entire work is built up by a succession of lyrics, each dealing with a single theme, each dealing with a single phase of the mental state, of the emotional state, of the intellectual state of the poet. The poet makes brilliant use of figures of speech in the work. Take, for example, the homely metaphor in Canto 40 of the bride leaving her father's house and the state of mind of the father, the state of mind of the mother at the time of the wedding. Similarly, section 95 of In Memoriam A.H.H, often looked upon as the climax of the work, contains the metaphor of the fallen leaves. The metaphor of the fallen leaves. The fallen leaves stand for the letters of the dead Hallam. Hallam is dead. But the poet has with him the letters written by Hallam to him. The poet sees them as fallen leaves, as dead leaves. The poet uses numerous symbols in his work. For example, in section 2 there is the yew tree. The yew tree, the huge yew tree, stands in the graveyard of the church. The changing seasons bring new flowers upon plants and trees and new lambs to the flock of sheep. But the yew tree continues to stand unchanged, while under its shade many men have been buried. It is generally accepted by critics that the yew tree in Canto 2 of In Memoriam A.H.H symbolizes death. In Canto 3, the poet makes use of apostrophe. The poet suddenly turns to sorrow and addresses sorrow. O sorrow, cruel fellowship! O priestess in the walls of death! O sweet and bitter inner breath! The poet suddenly turns towards sorrow and addresses the section to her, and thus the poet makes use of the figure of speech of apostrophe. The poet makes use of the dove simile in Canto 12. In section 12, the poet compares his soul heavily laden with grief to a dove that springs to bear through heaven a tale of woe. The poet compares his soul heavily laden with grief with a carrier pigeon flying high with a message of grief attached to its wings. Canto 15 opens with a spectacular use of the figure of speech of onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia rhetoricism is when the sound echoes the sense, and you are able to understand the meaning by just listening carefully to the sound. The sound conveys the meaning by itself. Let me read the opening stanza of section 15. Tonight the winds begin to rise and roar from yonder dropping day. The last red leaf is whirled away. The rocks are blown about the skies. The sound closely echoes the sense, and we can almost hear the storm breaking out while listening to these lines. Part of the strength of In Memoriam A.H.H is its vivid imagery. Tennyson taps numerous levels of life in order to generate the imagery of In Memoriam A.H.H. We have nature imagery, images drawn from nature, images of the seasons, of the trees, of the birds, of the rivers, of the fauna, of the flora of England. We have imagery from everyday life, such as that of masters and servants, imagery from science, imagery from religion, imagery from the personal experience of the poet. There is no doubt that the work under consideration has a very appropriate title. It was after much deliberation that Tennyson decided to title his work In Memoriam A.H.H. In fact, when it was a work in progress, the work was titled The Way of the Soul. The Way of the Soul is a title which effectively captures the totality of the work better than the present title. Because the work is not merely about Hallam or the death of Hallam. It's very much about the evolution of the poet, the spiritual evolution of the poet. However, Tennyson decided to discard the title The Way of the Soul and give the work the title In Memoriam A.H.H. There is no doubt that the present title has greater punch than the previous title. It also focuses attention on Hallam, the death of Hallam. Certainly, the present title of the work has contributed significantly to the popularity of the work. It is doubtful whether the work would have been so popular had it been titled The Way of the Soul, as Tennyson had first planned. That William Wordsworth is the greatest nature poet of the English language is a cliche oft repeated by students and teachers of literature. Be that as it may, Lord Tennyson is a very great nature poet. I would say that Tennyson is a strong contender for the position of the greatest nature poet of the English language. That in many ways the treatment of nature in Tennyson is superior to the treatment of nature in Wordsworth. However, Lord Tennyson did not make nature the crux of his ideology. He was no pantheist. He did not worship nature the way Wordsworth worshipped nature. And that is probably why we say that Wordsworth is a greater nature poet than Tennyson. However, the fact remains that Tennyson fell in love with nature as a schoolboy. He picked up the habit of going for long walks through the English countryside. He internalized the glories of the English countryside. And the impact that English nature had on him was spectacular. And it would be an impact which would last a lifetime. A close examination of In Memoriam A.H.H. demonstrates that Lord Tennyson was a gifted nature poet. We become familiar with the glories of English nature through the poem, the geography of England, the hills, the rivers, the brooks of England, the why in particular, are all spoken of in the work. The seasons of England come alive in the work. The sun, the moon, the stars, planets like the Venus are all mentioned in the work. Birds like pigeons, swallows, linnets, they fly in and out of the work. Trees like the sycamore, the yew tree, are all mentioned in the work. The sea is repeatedly mentioned. The beauties of English spring, with its glorious flowers, are spectacularly described. Tennyson speaks of typical English flowers like the rose, the tulip, the carnation. The description of nature by Tennyson or in Tennyson is more accurate, more scientific than the descriptions that we come across in the poetry of Wordsworth. Tennyson was a more keen observer of nature, a more informed observer of nature than Wordsworth was, and hence the descriptions are more accurate, more specific, and more scientific. The descriptions of the snow, the winter snow, the storm, high tide and low tide are all etched in the memory of the reader indelibly. However, it has to be pointed out that unlike Wordsworth, Tennyson did not worship nature. He was too informed. He had too profound a scientific knowledge of nature to worship nature blindly. In fact, in the work under consideration, in Memoriam A.H.H, he speaks of nature red in tooth and claw. Nature red in tooth and claw. This is very different from the deification of nature that we come across in Wordsworth. Tennyson becomes highly lyrical, powerfully evocative, while describing the beauties of nature. And the nature descriptions in Tennyson in general, and in Memoriam A.H.H in particular, are capable of rivaling the nature descriptions in Chaucer and Shakespeare. One cannot be a stranger to God and religion if one is a student of In Memoriam A.H.H. Tennyson was a highly informed person, a very well-read person, and he was keenly aware of the fundamental principles of all the major religions of the world. And this awareness is indicated in numerous places in his work. For example, he refers to classical mythology more than once in the work under discussion. Tennyson was well informed about the ancient Greek religion, the ancient Roman religion. Similarly, in Canto 124, the poet speaks of finding God in the sun. Finding God in the sun. It has to be remembered that the Gayatri Mantra, the creedal prayer of the Brahmin, is addressed to the sun. The poet alludes to pantheism in several of the cantos, including Canto 124. However, there is no doubt that In Memoriam A.H.H is written by a Christian author. In fact, if we try to read between the lines, we can detect an attempt on the part of the poet, a subtle attempt on the part of the poet to valorize Christianity, to place the Christian worldview, to place the Christian perspectives, to place the Christian way of thinking by the side of other worldviews, other perspectives, other ways of thinking, and to demonstrate in an indirect manner that the former is superior to the latter. Despite all his self-doubt, despite the streak of rebellion in his personality, despite his tendency to question and challenge everything, Tennyson was a devout Christian at heart, especially in his later years. And there is no doubt that In Memoriam A.H.H is written by a devout Christian, or at least by a devout Christian in the making. It is not an accident that Queen Victoria, a devout Christian herself, was extremely fond of this work, and that she copied several of the cantos in her own hand in her personal notebook. The son of a clergyman, Alfred Tennyson, was extremely familiar with the Bible, the Holy Bible. And there are numerous allusions and references to the Bible in Memoriam A.H.H. That God created the world, that God is all-powerful, that God consists of the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, that humanity is a tribe of sinners, that Jesus died on the cross in order to save humanity from damnation, that Jesus preaches the gospel of universal love. These are the concepts which are part of the ideological underpinnings of In Memoriam A.H.H. It is extremely significant that In Memoriam A.H.H begins with a reference to Jesus Christ. The very first line of the prologue is strong Son of God, immortal love. I repeat, strong Son of God, immortal love. Thus, the work begins on a very Christian note. It is equally significant that the work concludes with a reference to Jesus Christ, just as it opens with a reference to Jesus Christ. The last line, the last two lines of the epilogue alludes to the second coming of Christ. The second coming of Christ is prophesied in the Bible, in the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Revelation. And this is how the epilogue and the work as a whole concludes. And one far-off divine event to which the whole creation moves. Thus, the work begins on a Christian note and ends on a Christian note, displays the author's profound familiarity with the Holy Bible, attempts to bring into conjunction the Christian worldview, the Christian perspectives, and the Christian way of thinking with other worldviews, other perspectives, and other ways of thinking, and to demonstrate the superiority of the former. Thus, In Memoriam A.H.H is very much a Christian work written by a Christian author. Though the Christian element in the work is often muted, subtle, and nuanced. In Memoriam A.H.H was one of the most popular works of the Victorian period. It sold extremely well for a book of verse, was universally respected, and was praised lavishly by critics. One of the reasons for this is that it is a very representative work. It closely reflects the Victorian age, its ideas and ideals, its conflicts and contradictions, its achievements and failures, its strengths and weaknesses. Queen Victoria herself admired the work very much and took the pains to copy some of the cantos of In Memoriam A.H.H in her own hand in her notebook. She remarked more than once that reading the work provided her with much needed relief, much needed comfort, much needed solace, especially after the untimely demise of her husband, Prince Albert, the Prince Consort. The Victorian period was the period of empire. It is said that the sun never used to set in the British Empire. The British succeeded in putting together an empire bigger than any other empire in history. But the heart of this empire was England. And the metropolis of this empire was London. In Memoriam A.H.H is a work which emanates from England, from London, and which closely reflects the physical reality of England, the geographical reality of England, the topographical reality of England. We come across the hills, the dales, the rivers, the brooks, the fields, the farms of England in the work. And the descriptions of these things are extremely close to reality, extremely detailed and extremely close to reality. The Victorians like to boast that the world had two intellectual capitals, Oxford and Cambridge. One of these two capitals, Cambridge, is the locus of the work. As the British Empire spread all over the globe, the Victorians came into contact with other peoples professing other religions other than Christianity. The work under discussion alludes to religions other than Christianity, to religious perspectives other than the Christian perspective. Thus, we have references to pantheism in the work. Thus, we have references to the worship of the sun, the finding of God in the sun in the work. And we must remember that the Gayatri Mantra, the creedal prayer of the Brahmin, is addressed to the sun. We get vivid pictures of Victorian society in the work. And Victorian society was a society of rigid class distinctions. Canto 64, for example, throws light on the infinite distance between the great and the low, the great and the low in Victorian England. Canto 60 tells the tale of a poor girl who falls in love with an aristocrat, and the problems and difficulties that such a romance would encounter in Victorian England. Canto 20 speaks of masters and servants, and Victorian society was very much a society of masters and servants. One of the most cherished institutions of Victorian England was the family. And the family was said to consist of the father, the mother, and the children. The unquestioned and unquestionable head of the family was the father. This is very clear from a diligent reading of In Memoriam A.H.H. Christmas was easily the most important religious event in Victorian England, religious festival in Victorian England. And there are quite a few references to Christmas in the work, to the celebration of Christmas in the work. There are also references to Christmas trees. There were no Christmas trees in England before the time of Queen Victoria. The practice of erecting the Christmas tree was a German practice. It was brought to England when Prince Albert married Queen Victoria, and Prince Albert was German. It spread rapidly all over England, and it became a characteristically Victorian practice. And the Christmas tree is referred to more than once in the work under discussion. Science experienced a spectacular expansion in the Victorian age, and there are numerous references, allusions to science, to the achievements of science, to the discoveries of science, to the inventions of science in the work. The theories of science are alluded to, referred to in the work. There is no doubt that the author of the work is a person quite familiar with the latest achievements in the scientific field. The Victorian period was a period of conflict and compromise between science and religion, reason and faith, doubt and conviction, and The work under discussion is very much a site for these conflicts and these compromises. The Victorian period was a period of great political change, of reform, of evolution, of the enlargement of the franchise, and political questions were much debated in Victorian England. There are several allusions, references to political issues, to revolutions like the French Revolution, to the questions of power, the limits on power, the responsibilities that go with power, the arbitrary use of power, the necessity for checks and balances. The mainstream religion of Victorian England was, of course, Christianity. The Victorians were convinced that Christianity was the only true religion, and this conviction is an underlying presence throughout In Memoriam A.H.H. The poet repeatedly attempts to juxtapose the Christian worldview, the Christian perspectives, the Christian beliefs with other worldviews, other perspectives, other beliefs, and to demonstrate in a subtle, indirect, nuanced manner the superiority of the Christian way of thinking over the other ways of thinking. It is extremely significant that the work begins with a reference to Jesus Christ, and the work also concludes with a reference to Jesus Christ. The very opening lines of the prologue and the very closing lines of the epilogue refer to the Son of God and to the second coming of Christ, respectively. Finally, the Victorians displayed a marked tendency to fetishize the dead. And it is this tendency that is responsible for creating In Memoriam A.H.H. Queen Victoria went into mourning when her husband, Prince Albert, the Prince Consort, breathed his last and spent the rest of her long life in mourning. Only the Victorian period, which believed in fetishizing the dead, could have succeeded in producing such a monumental elegy, such a monumental requiem as In Memoriam A.H.H. of Lord Tennyson. Students sometimes say that the first romantic poets in the English language were William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Nothing could be more shockingly wrong. Romanticism in English poetry is at least as old as Geoffrey Chaucer. There is remarkable romanticism in Spenser, in Shakespeare, in Sidney. That is why the movement spearheaded by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge is called the Romantic Revival. The movement that was inaugurated in 1898 with the publication of the lyrical ballads of William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge is the Romantic Revival. What are the features of the Romantic Revival? If you examine closely, you find almost all the features of the poetry of the Romantic Revival to be present in the poetry of Lord Tennyson in general and in Memoriam A.H.H. in particular. The poets of the Romantic Revival rejected the tyranny of the heroic couplet. Practically all of neoclassical poetry is in the heroic couplet. But Wordsworth and Coleridge opted for the path of experimentation, for the path of change, for the path of variety. Needless to say, In Memoriam A.H.H. does not utilize the heroic couplet. Instead, the work is divided into cantos, and every canto is further divided into stanzas. Each line is an iambic tetrameter. Tetra means four. Every line consists of 4 feet, and every foot is an iamb. An iamb is a foot which consists of a short syllable, an unstressed syllable, followed by a long syllable. The neoclassicals generally prefer to write about men and women of rank and not about ordinary people. On the other hand, the Romantic poets prefer to write about ordinary people. Sometimes these people were from the margins of society, such as the solitary reaper of Wordsworth or the leech gatherer of Wordsworth. Coming to In Memoriam A.H.H., it cannot be said that Hallam and Tennyson were from the margins of society. At the same time, they were no aristocrats. They were from the middle class. To that extent, In Memoriam A.H.H. incorporates an important feature of Romantic poetry. There was hardly any nature, any treatment of nature in neoclassical poetry. Neoclassical poetry was city-oriented rather than village-oriented. On the other hand, nature is the most important theme of Romantic poetry. William Wordsworth said, "Let nature be your teacher." Lord Tennyson rivals William Wordsworth for the position of the greatest nature poet of the English language. Tennyson was a born lover of nature. He started loving nature as a child, as a boy, and as a schoolboy he picked up the habit of going for long walks through the English countryside. He was a keen and sensitive observer of nature. And In Memoriam A.H.H. is a feast for nature lovers. Tennyson becomes lyrical when he writes about the sun, the moon, the stars, the planets, the sky, the wind, the sea, the hills, the mountains, the brooks, the lakes, the rivers. We get brilliant descriptions of the glories of English nature in the work. The trees that are mentioned include the sycamore, the yew tree, the maple. The birds that are mentioned include the thrush, the nightingale, the swallow, the dove. The flowers that are mentioned include the rose, the carnation, the daisy. Neoclassical poetry came from the head. Romantic poetry came from the heart. Neoclassical poetry was more cerebral. Romantic poetry was more emotional. In Memoriam A.H.H, there is absolutely no effort to restrain emotion. In fact, some critics have complained of the wild emotionalism that is found in the work. The poet seems to cherish his emotions. The poet seems to think that there is nothing wrong in expressing his emotions without any inhibition. An important thematic strand of romantic poetry is the relationship between lovers. In In Memoriam A.H.H, there are two sets of lovers at the very least. To begin with, there is Hallam, who was in love with Tennyson's sister Emily or Emilia. Hallam and Emily were engaged and were planning to get married when Hallam suddenly passed away. Tennyson's sister Cecily or Cecilia conducted a romance with a young man called Edmund Law Lushington. Edmund Law Lushington, who later became professor of Greek at the University of Glasgow. And the work concludes with an epilogue which celebrates the wedding of Edmund Law Lushington and Cecilia. The supernatural played a significant role in romantic poetry. The work under consideration is not lacking in the supernatural touch. We have references to ghosts in the work. We have references to dreams which are more than mere dreams in the work. As a conclusion, it can be said that Lord Tennyson was the last of the great romantic poets, the last poet of the tradition inaugurated by Wordsworth and Coleridge, and that In Memoriam A.H.H was the masterpiece of Lord Tennyson, the romantic poet.